In a world where love is supposed to be unconditional, what happens when a mother's heart is cold and her love withheld? Meet Sara, a young girl whose life is shattered by the cruelty of the one person she should have been able to rely on, her mother. What would you do if the person you loved most, the person who should protect you, refused to care for you? Imagine being left hungry and helpless, with no understanding of why. But when the truth is revealed, everything Sara thought she knew about love and family is turned upside down. This shocking story will leave you questioning what true motherhood really means and whether forgiveness can ever heal the deepest wounds. You won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this story will have you on the edge of your seat. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Sara lived in a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of town, nestled in a neighborhood where the cracks in the sidewalks seemed to mirror the cracks in her own heart. Her mother, Tanya, was distant, emotionally, physically, and mentally. To most people who saw them together, they appeared to be just another struggling family. But beneath the surface, something darker was at play, something that Sara couldn't fully understand as a young girl, but felt deep within her every day. The apartment was poorly lit, with a faint musty odor that lingered in every room. The walls were thin, and the sounds of the neighbors' lives seemed to seep in, adding to the feeling of suffocation Sara often felt. It was a place that never felt like home, a place where warmth and comfort were as absent as the smile from her mother's face. Tanya, her mother, was a woman whose demeanor could be described as a perpetual coldness. Her eyes were always distant, as if she were lost in a world of her own pain. She moved through life with a certain rigidity, almost mechanical in her daily routine. There was no affection in her voice, no warmth in her touch, and no kindness in her heart. Tanya had once been a vibrant young woman, full of dreams and possibilities, but those dreams had long since withered away, replaced by bitterness and resentment that seemed to define every aspect of her being. Sara, on the other hand, was a child filled with boundless hope, a heart so pure that it contrasted starkly with the coldness she received at home. Every day, she tried to be the best daughter she could be, despite the lack of nurturing or love from Tanya. She would come home from school, her face beaming with the joy of learning, hoping her mother would ask about her day, even offer a smile or a kind word. But all she would get in return was silence or harsh words that stung far more than any physical punishment could. Tanya worked long hours in a low-paying job at a nearby grocery store. The hours were grueling, the pay barely enough to keep the lights on and the rent paid. Despite this, Sara often found herself alone, left to fend for herself after school. She would spend her afternoons in the small, dingy apartment, doing her homework in the dim light, her stomach rumbling as she tried to ignore the gnawing hunger. Sometimes, she would sneak into the kitchen to see if there was any food left from the night before, but the cupboards were usually bare. Tanya would come home late, her face weary from the long day. But Sara, with the innocence of a child, would still hope for a little kindness, a little acknowledgement of her presence. She would greet her mother with excitement, only to be met with a cold, dismissive glance. "Mama, I'm so hungry," Sara would say, her voice filled with the kind of desperation only a child could feel. "Can we have something to eat?" But Tanya would barely register her presence. "There's nothing here," she would mutter, dismissing Sara's needs as if they were an inconvenience. "Go to bed." The lack of food was a constant source of distress. For a while, Sara would try to find ways to occupy her time, distracting herself from the pain of hunger. She would read books or try to sleep through the gnawing sensation in her stomach. She even started pretending that she wasn't hungry, trying to convince herself that she could survive without food. But it was getting harder, and the loneliness began to take a toll on her young mind. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the apartment in a dim, cold light, Sara returned home after a long day at school. Her stomach growled as she walked in the door, and she went straight to the kitchen, hoping that today might be different. Maybe her mother had bought something to eat, or maybe there would be some leftover scraps from the day before. But when she opened the refrigerator, she found it empty. The shelves were bare, except for a few bottles of ketchup and mustard. Tanya sat at the table, her back turned to Sara as she absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone. She didn't even acknowledge Sara's presence. "Mama, I'm really hungry," Sara said, her voice quiet but desperate. She had tried to be patient, tried to hold on to hope, but the hunger was unbearable. "Can't we just have something to eat? Please." Tanya didn't even look up. "There's nothing left," she replied coldly. "Go to bed." Sara felt a sharp pang of disbelief in her chest. How could her mother say that? Sara had seen the food that Tanya bought, the food that was clearly meant to last them for the week. And yet, here she was, standing in front of an empty fridge, starving, while her mother acted as if it didn't matter at all. Tanya's voice broke through her thoughts. "You know, it's not my fault you're hungry. You should have eaten something at school," she snapped, her tone biting. Sara froze. The word stung. She had no control over the food situation, no control over the emptiness that was growing inside her. But her mother was placing the blame on her, as if her hunger was her own fault. Sara wanted to cry, wanted to scream, but instead, she swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "I'll be fine," Sara whispered, though she wasn't sure she could believe it. As she walked away from the kitchen, her mind raced. Why was her mother like this? Why didn't she care about her? Why was Sara always left to fend for herself? This was the harsh reality that Sara faced every day. Her mother's refusal to feed her wasn't just about food. It was about something deeper, something darker that Sara couldn't yet understand. Little did Sara know, this was only the beginning of a much larger, much more painful revelation. What would happen next would change everything she thought she knew about her mother, and about herself. Tanya's indifference was more than just neglect. It was a deliberate and cruel form of emotional abandonment. Her behavior towards Sara went beyond simply failing to care for her daughter's needs. It was as if she took pleasure in watching her child suffer. This was the way Tanya had chosen to live her life, wrapped in bitterness and resentment, and she had no intention of breaking free from it. Every day, Tanya would come home from work, her face tight with exhaustion, and retreat into her own world. Sara, still a little girl, would greet her mother with the hope that today might be different. But it never was. Tanya's eyes were always vacant, as though she were looking past Sara, not seeing her at all. Sara would speak to her, but the words fell on deaf ears. There were no smiles, no "How was your day, honey?" Only harsh words, cold glares, and a silence that echoed in the small apartment. Even the most basic acts of love, feeding Sara, helping her with homework, comforting her when she was scared, were beyond Tanya's capability. It was as if Sara's needs were invisible to her mother, as if Sara was nothing more than a burden to be ignored. There was no affection, no physical touch, no hugs or words of reassurance. All Sara wanted was for her mother to see her, to acknowledge that she existed, to feel loved. But Tanya's heart was locked away, unreachable. There were times when Sara couldn't understand why her mother behaved this way. She had always been taught that mothers loved their children unconditionally, that they would protect them, provide for them, and nurture them through life's challenges. But Tanya was the complete opposite. She would look at Sara with a coldness that sent a chill through the young girl's heart. Her mother's harsh words and actions left Sara feeling small and insignificant, as though she didn't matter at all. It wasn't just a lack of love or care. It was a complete disregard for Sara's basic needs. Every time Sara asked for something to eat, she was met with coldness or outright rejection. Sometimes, Tanya would tell her that there was no food, or that Sara should have eaten at school. Other times, she would accuse Sara of being lazy or ungrateful for asking for something so simple. There was always an excuse, a reason why Tanya couldn't or wouldn't help her daughter. At first, Sara would sit quietly, hoping that things would get better. She tried to be patient, tried to understand that maybe her mother was tired or stressed. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Sara's patience began to wear thin. She couldn't continue pretending that everything was okay when her stomach was empty, when her heart ached for something, anything, that could make her feel loved and cared for. One afternoon, after returning from school, Sara found herself in the same position once again. She had skipped lunch, knowing her mother would be too distracted or indifferent to notice. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Tanya would offer her some food when she got home. But when Sara walked through the door, her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, completely detached from the world around her. "Mama, I'm really hungry," Sara said, her voice quieter this time, as if she were already prepared for the rejection. "Can I please have something to eat?" Tanya didn't even look up from her phone. "I don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath, waving Sara off like an annoying fly. Sara's chest tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she wandered into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the barren shelves. She pulled open the fridge, hoping to find something to eat, but it was just as empty as before. She walked to the cupboards, finding only stale crackers and a few cans of soup, none of which would be enough to satisfy her hunger. Frustration built within her. She grabbed one of the cans of soup and tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. She found a can opener, but it was old and rusty, and the lid still wouldn't open. Her hands trembled as she sat on the floor, staring at the can in front of her. It was as if even the simplest efforts were being blocked by the universe itself. But she didn't give up. Sara wasn't the type to give up easily. She tried to heat up the soup using an old pot, but even that effort was thwarted. The stove was broken, and it had been for weeks. Tanya didn't care enough to fix it. Sara felt the tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry. She couldn't afford to be weak. Frustrated and desperate, Sara started looking around the apartment. She knew that there had to be something, anything, she could eat. She opened the pantry doors again, hoping to find something she had missed. But all she found were a few crumbs of old bread, a bag of rice that had been sitting there for months, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. It wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. The hours passed, and Tanya never once checked on her. She didn't ask if Sara had eaten, if she was okay. Tanya's world was one where only she mattered. Everything Sara did seemed to go unnoticed, as if her existence was simply an afterthought in her mother's life. Sara began to feel a deep sadness settle in her chest. She wasn't just hungry, she was emotionally starving. The isolation she felt was suffocating, and the confusion over her mother's behavior only deepened her sense of loneliness. Why was her mother so cruel? Why couldn't she love her? Why was she being punished for things she didn't understand? Days passed like this. Sara trying to survive on scraps, finding ways to feed herself on the small crumbs she could scrounge up, all while Tanya continued her indifferent, cold existence. Sara was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about food. It was about something deeper, something that Sara couldn't quite put into words, but could feel in the pit of her stomach. Her mother's cruelty wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Tanya had made a decision to ignore her daughter, to withhold the most basic of human needs. And Sara had no idea why. The toll this was taking on Sara's emotional health was immense. She felt like a ghost in her own home, invisible, unwanted, and unloved. Each day felt like a struggle to survive, not just physically but emotionally. The girl who once radiated joy was now a shell of herself, hollowed out by neglect and abandonment. Her innocence was fading, replaced by a deep sadness that she didn't know how to escape. As the days passed, Sara's struggle became more intense. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at her insides. She had learned to hide it, to pretend that she wasn't desperate for food, but her body betrayed her. Her stomach would growl loudly in the quiet of the night, and the exhaustion from going without proper meals wore her down. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't give in to the weakness she felt, because deep down, she knew that if she did, it would only make her mother's indifference more apparent. Sara had become resourceful, though it was out of necessity. She had learned to search for food in places she never would have thought to look before. She would go to the neighbors' apartments, knock on their doors, and ask for scraps. Sometimes, they would give her something: half-eaten sandwiches, leftover rice, a bowl of soup. At other times, she would just stand there, staring at them with pleading eyes, hoping for something. But more often than not, she was sent away empty-handed. The looks they gave her weren't ones of sympathy. They were uncomfortable, awkward, as if they too were unsure of how to respond to her constant need. There were days when Sara would scour the alleyways near the apartment complex, searching through garbage bins for discarded food. She would find old, moldy bread or a half-eaten apple, and she would devour it without a second thought, not caring about the filth, not caring about the risk of sickness. She was just hungry. The hunger was becoming unbearable, and the isolation only made it worse. But no matter how many times she searched for food or begged for help, it never felt like enough. Her mother remained unmoved, never once offering to share any of the food they had. Sara's world had become a battle for survival, a battle she was fighting alone. One afternoon, as Sara sat in the living room, trying to study for school, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. Her mother had invited a woman over, a friend or acquaintance, someone Sara had seen around but never really spoken to. They were in the kitchen, talking, unaware that Sara had snuck into the hallway, just outside the door. At first, the conversation seemed normal. They were talking about the weather, about things that didn't matter to Sara. But then, Tanya's voice lowered, and Sara, curiosity piqued, moved closer to hear better. "You know," Tanya said, her voice sharp and cold, "I don't even know why I bother. She's always asking for food, but I can't stand her. I can't stand how she looks at me, like I owe her something. It's exhausting, always having to take care of her." Sara felt her heart tighten in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her own mother, someone who was supposed to love her unconditionally, was speaking about her like she was a burden, a nuisance. Tanya continued, her words dripping with disdain. "I've been keeping food for myself. I know she's hungry, but why should I feed her? She should learn to fend for herself. I don't have to give her everything she wants. Maybe if she learned to be more independent, she wouldn't need me so much." Sara could hardly breathe as she pressed her ear closer to the door, her hands trembling. Tanya was speaking so casually, as if it were normal to withhold food from a child, to intentionally let her suffer. Tanya's words cut deeper than any physical wound could have. Sara had always known that something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it from her mother's own lips, was like a slap in the face. "But she's your daughter," the woman said, sounding surprised. "How can you just let her go hungry? Isn't that a bit cruel?" Tanya's laughter was cold and hollow. "Cruel? She needs to learn a lesson. I'm not going to coddle her. She's too dependent, and that's not good for her. She needs to learn what the world is really like." Sara's world tilted on its axis. She felt as though the floor had been pulled out from under her, and she was falling into a void of disbelief. The realization hit her like a freight train. All this time, she had thought her mother was neglecting her out of some kind of necessity, that maybe they just didn't have enough food, that maybe things were harder than they seemed. But the truth was far worse. Tanya wasn't neglecting her because she couldn't provide. She was withholding food because she simply didn't want to. Sara's heart shattered into a million pieces. She had spent so much of her young life trying to understand her mother's coldness, trying to rationalize the hurt and the rejection. But now, with the weight of this terrible truth pressing down on her, Sara realized that none of it made sense. Tanya didn't love her. Tanya didn't care. And now Sara understood that her suffering was not just a consequence of poverty. It was the result of her mother's cruelty, her selfishness, and her deep emotional detachment. The tears that had been building up for so long finally spilled over. Sara pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sobs, not wanting Tanya to hear. But it was impossible to hold them back. The pain was too overwhelming, too much to bear. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. Tanya's voice broke through Sara's thoughts. "I'm not going to feel guilty for this. She'll figure it out. She has to." Sara stood there in the hallway, her body trembling, her heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. She felt like she was drowning, and the more she tried to swim, the deeper she sank. For a long time, she didn't know what to do. She wanted to scream, to confront her mother, to tell her everything that had been building inside her. But what good would it do? Tanya had made it clear that she didn't care, that she would never care. The anger bubbled up inside Sara, hot and fierce. How could her own mother do this to her? Why had she been so blind, so naive? To think that things could ever be different. But as the anger grew, so did the heartbreak. Because in that moment, Sara realized something even more painful. She wasn't just angry at her mother. She was angry at herself for wanting something that wasn't possible, for wanting love from someone who could never give it. Tears streamed down Sara's face as she stood frozen in the hallway. She had no idea what her next step would be. All she knew was that the woman she had once looked up to, the woman she had desperately tried to please, was the one who had caused her pain all along. This moment, this devastating discovery, was a turning point. Sara would never look at her mother the same way again. She couldn't. What had once been a confusing relationship had now become a prison of resentment, a place where Sara was no longer just neglected. She was intentionally hurt, and that would change everything. Sara's discovery about her mother's cruelty marked a pivotal moment in the young girl's life. For so long, Sara had struggled with the question of why her mother treated her this way. Why was Tanya so cold, so distant, so indifferent to her own daughter's suffering? Now, Sara had the answers, but the truth was far more complex than she could have ever imagined. Tanya's neglect wasn't just a result of apathy or selfishness. It was rooted in something deeper, something that had been buried beneath the surface for years. In the days following her overheard conversation, Sara found herself replaying the words Tanya had said over and over in her mind. As much as she tried to push them out, they lingered, haunting her. But as the anger and heartbreak began to subside, something else started to take shape in her mind. There was something more to Tanya's behavior, something Sara hadn't considered before. Tanya had never spoken about her past, never shared any details about her childhood or her relationships. She kept everything locked away, as if the past were a dark secret that could never be spoken of. But Sara had learned that secrets, no matter how well they're hidden, always find a way to surface. One evening, when Tanya had returned home from work, looking as tired and cold as ever, Sara decided to confront her. The time had come to finally get some answers, to understand why her mother had always been so cruel. She didn't know what she was expecting. A harsh refusal, more coldness, perhaps even anger. But Sara knew that she had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Mama," Sara said softly, standing in the doorway of the living room. Tanya didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her. But Sara was determined to make her mother listen. Tanya sighed heavily and waved a dismissive hand. "What is it now, Sara? I want to know why you're like this. Why do you treat me this way?" Sara asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. It felt like a question she had been carrying her entire life. Tanya didn't respond immediately. She just stared at her daughter for a long moment, her eyes cold and distant. But then something shifted. For the first time, Tanya's defenses seemed to crumble, if only slightly. She stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city below, her back to Sara. "I don't know how to be a mother," Tanya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never learned how." Sara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She had expected anger, denial, or more indifference. But not this. Tanya continued, her voice shaking now. I never had a mother who loved me. I never had anyone to show me how to be a parent, how to love a child. My own mother, she was worse than I am. She didn't care about me. She didn't care about anything except her own pain, her own misery. She didn't know how to love, and neither did I. Sara's mind raced. She had always known that Tanya was closed off, but she never imagined the depth of her mother's pain. Tanya's past wasn't just a story of neglect. It was a history of abuse, of being raised in an environment where love and care were foreign concepts. The woman who had brought her into the world had been hurt deeply, and in turn, she had hurt Sara. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason. I was never enough for her, Tanya continued, her voice breaking as memories from her past resurfaced. She didn't want me, and that's all I ever knew. I didn't learn how to love you because I didn't know how to love myself. I didn't know how to be a mother, and I've been pretending for so long that I could fake it. But I can't. I can't keep pretending that I'm something I'm not. Sara stood there, speechless. She had imagined 1,000 reasons for her mother's behavior, but she never could have guessed that Tanya's cruelty came from such a dark, painful place. It was almost too much to bear, the weight of Tanya's brokenness. But as Sara listened to her mother's confession, something shifted within her. She felt a deep, gnawing sorrow for Tanya, but she also felt something else, a growing sense of strength. Tanya's past was tragic, but it wasn't Sara's fault. Sara wasn't responsible for the wounds her mother carried, and she couldn't let her mother's pain define her own life. The truth, as painful as it was, brought clarity. It explained why Tanya had never been able to offer Sara the love and care she needed, but it also illuminated something else. Sara didn't have to carry that same burden. She didn't have to repeat the cycle of pain and neglect. As Tanya broke down, sobbing quietly in the corner of the room, Sara felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sorrow, pity, but also something else, resolve. Despite everything she had endured, despite the years of neglect, Sara wasn't going to let her mother's brokenness crush her. She wasn't going to let it dictate her future. I don't want to live like this anymore, Sara said quietly, her voice firm, though her heart was heavy. I won't live like this anymore. I need to get away from this, from you. The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy with finality. Tanya's sobs grew louder, but Sara couldn't stay. She had spent too long trying to understand her mother, trying to make her love her. Now, for the first time in her life, Sara realized that she had to let go. She had to find a way to take control of her own life, to break free from the cycle of pain and neglect that had been passed down to her. Sara didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but she knew one thing for certain. She would survive. She would find a way to thrive, to heal from the wounds of her past. And one day, she would look back at this moment as the turning point, the moment when she took control of her destiny and chose to live for herself, no longer bound by her mother's mistakes. The weight of the truth hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and heavy, but for Sara, the revelation about her mother's past had become the catalyst for something far greater than mere understanding. As Tanya collapsed in tears, her sobs echoing through the silent room, Sara stood motionless, absorbing every word. The tears that had once threatened to spill over now felt distant, unimportant. What mattered now was her future, her survival. For the first time, Sara felt a sense of clarity. Tanya's cruelty, her neglect, it wasn't her fault. Sara couldn't change what had happened, nor could she make her mother into someone she wasn't. But Sara could change herself. She could take control of her life and free herself from the suffocating grip of this toxic environment. Tanya's sobs grew quieter as Sara turned to leave the room. It was time to act. Sara knew what she had to do. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady and firm. Tanya's eyes widened, her tears freezing in place as she looked up in disbelief. "What? No, you can't. You're my daughter. You can't just leave me like this." Sara didn't respond immediately. She didn't have to. The truth had been laid bare, and there was nothing more to say. She had spent her entire life longing for her mother's love, trying to earn affection that was never given. But now, for the first time, Sara realized that she was worthy of so much more. She was worthy of kindness, of care, of a chance at a future that didn't include the suffocating grip of her mother's cruelty. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay here," Sara said, her voice unwavering. "I can't keep pretending like everything is okay. I need to find my own way, my own path." Without another word, Sara walked out of the apartment. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't remain in that broken place any longer. The streets outside felt vast and unfamiliar, but Sara didn't feel afraid. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Sara found herself walking through the city, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She had no money, no plan, but she had something more important: determination. She would figure it out. She had to. She wasn't going to let the past define her. She would survive. As Sara made her way through the bustling streets, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw that it was a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the message. "I'm sorry, Sara. I've been a terrible mother. Please come back. I'll try to change." The message was brief, but it struck Sara like a blow to the chest. Tanya, her cold, distant mother, was apologizing? Could this really be the beginning of change? Could her mother truly recognize the damage she had done and make amends? Sara stood still for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her. She could go back. She could return to the broken home she had just left behind, and maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Or she could keep moving forward, carving her own path, and leaving behind the remnants of her painful past. Her heart was torn. Part of her still longed for a connection with her mother, for the warmth she had never known. But another part of her knew that she couldn't go back to the life she had just escaped. She couldn't continue to live in a cycle of neglect and pain. Tanya's message could be a turning point, but Sara wasn't sure if it was too late for them. Could a mother who had hurt her so deeply ever truly change? And if she did, would it be enough to rebuild the broken trust between them? As Sara stood there, caught between the past and the future, she knew one thing for certain. Her decision would shape her life forever. The choice was hers to make, and whatever path she chose, she would not be the same person she was when she left that apartment. The story ends on a cliffhanger as Sara stares at the message, uncertain of what to do next. The viewers are left wondering what Sara's next move will be. Will she return to Tanya, hoping for a chance at redemption, or will she continue on her journey, determined to build a new life, free from her mother's shadow? The uncertainty of Sara's future looms large, and the story leaves an open-ended possibility for both characters to change, grow, and ultimately seek healing, together or apart. As Sara walked away, the world around her seemed to blur, as if the weight of her choices and the uncertainty of her future had wrapped the world in a heavy fog. Her mind raced with questions, and her heart ached with the unknown. The decision she had just made would shape her life in ways she could never fully anticipate. But one thing was clear. She had taken control of her destiny, something she had been denied for far too long. What does true motherhood really mean? Is it just the act of giving birth? Or does it require something deeper, something more profound than a biological connection? In Sara's case, the word mother had been tainted by emotional neglect, and the love she so desperately craved had been withheld by the very person who was meant to provide it. But what if Tanya could change? What if the power of love and forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds? Emotional neglect doesn't just hurt in the moment. It lingers, shaping lives in ways that can't be easily undone. It affects how we see ourselves, how we interact with others, and how we navigate the world. For Sara, the pain of her mother's cruelty had been an invisible scar that she carried with her for years. Yet, despite all the hurt, she had found the strength to walk away, to take the first step toward healing. As the camera pans out, leaving Sara standing in the streets, viewers are left with a final question. Can love truly heal even the deepest wounds? Or does the damage of the past leave scars that never fade? The story of Sara and Tanya is a reminder that family dynamics are complex and fragile. True love, true motherhood, is not about what we say. It's about how we act, how we care, how we show up for those who need us. And sometimes it's about forgiveness, the courage to let go of the past and rebuild what has been broken. As viewers reflect on Sara's journey, they are invited to think about the relationships in their own lives and what it takes to truly heal, grow, and move forward. In the end, it is not just about survival. It is about the choice to live, to choose love over bitterness, and to seek the redemption that is within all of us. If you found Sara's story powerful and thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more emotional, inspiring stories. Every share helps spread awareness about the importance of love, forgiveness, and emotional healing. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your reflections on the story. Have you ever experienced the impact of emotional neglect or struggled with family dynamics? Let's keep the conversation going and support each other on this journey of growth and healing. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that will touch your heart.